That was just a practice. Just everybody take a deep breath. Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on H.R. 4248, Representative Cartwright's Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, the amendments of 2019. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and to the ranking minority member or their designees. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent for Congressman Glenn Thompson to sit at the dais and to participate in this morning's hearing. Hearing no objections, that too is so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank you all for being here with us today. To begin, I want to emphasize the bipartisan nature of this legislation and thank Congressman Cartwright and Congressman Glenn Thompson, a former longtime Republican member of this committee, for their work on this bill and their long-standing commitment to addressing the tremendous numbers of abandoned coal mines that are still endangering people's safety and the environment across the country. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I hope we can get this bill onto the House floor and enacted into law long before the abandoned mine land program expires. I know Congress is known for waiting until the last possible second on absolutely everything. So discussing this bill nearly 2 full years before expiration may seem out of character. But this is a problem that isn't going away. And our states and our communities need the certainty that would come with an early reauthorization. I think the coal industry deserves that certainty as well. Over 40 years ago, the Abandoned Mine Land Program was enacted with the key idea that I believe we can all agree upon, that the coal industry should pay for its legacy of pollution and not have the American public pay. For more than 200 years, the coal industry in the United States boomed. Coal powered the world's largest economy and helped us to win the Second World War. But while the industry soared, the cleanup was left unregulated, and left behind were rivers running red with pollution, mountains of waste rocks, webs of unstable mine shafts, and massive scars across the landscape. Thankfully, in 1977, Congress passed the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act, or SMCRA, which created a system designed to ensure that all new surface mines would be properly reclaimed and would not leave behind harmful environmental degradation. SMCRA also established a system for cleaning up abandoned mines. This system required the coal industry to chip in a small fee to fix the health, safety, and environmental hazards that had been left behind for so many years. The AML program has been in place for more than 40 years now, and with it, we've been able to make some real progress. Nearly $6 billion have been awarded to states and tribes across the country to clean up these sites. That's $6 billion worth of cleaner water, cleaner land, jobs, and economic opportunity. I look forward to hearing more about some of these successes today. But still, the cleanup is far from done. It's estimated that there are more than $10 billion worth of abandoned coal mine sites that still need to be reclaimed. And as I've alluded to, The fees being paid by the coal industry are set to expire in less than 2 years. 2 years is not enough time to clean up 2 centuries of pollution. There is no doubt that the coal industry is in decline. Even with the fierce support from the Trump administration, coal company after coal company has fallen into bankruptcy. Just last week, Murray Energy became the latest coal giant to go under. And as these companies go bankrupt, the executives get golden parachutes while they seek to shed their generations-old promises to pay for the retired, the sick, the widows, and the widowers. Many in the industry say they can no longer afford to pay the AML fee. But if they're absolved of that responsibility, that becomes one more thing that falls on the people the industry left behind. Dealing with polluted waters they can't drink, suffering from diseases that shorten the quality and length of their lives, and living in towns that are desperate for new economic opportunities. Workers and communities are being hit hard by the decline of coal. They need new jobs and economic development opportunities, and they need them now. The AML program and the Reclaim Act, which we reported out of this committee earlier this year, provides just that. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 4248, a bipartisan piece of legislation led in part by my colleague and former member of the House Natural Resources Committee, Representative Glenn Thompson, and Representative Cartwright, both from Pennsylvania. I am pleased to welcome him back to the committee today as we discuss this legislation and consider the future of the abandoned mine land program. Coal mining is essential to American energy security, providing an affordable, reliable source of baseload energy that can be relied on any place, anytime. Coal provides nearly 1/3 of U.S. energy generation and roughly 53,500 high-paying jobs across 16 states. This winter, when other resources such as wind and solar were unable to provide consistent and affordable energy due to extreme temperatures and snowstorms, communities across the country will rely on coal to keep the lights on. Further, coal production supports the provision of critical services in energy-producing states, including public education, infrastructure, and environmental mitigation. Coal mining on federal lands alone returned over $514 million in non-tax revenue to the states and the federal government in 2018. Despite claims by extremists to keep it in the ground movement, the U.S. has sufficient recoverable coal reserves to power our country for years to come. With over 250 billion short tons of recoverable coal reserves available, we can rely on coal as a baseload energy source for more than 3.5 centuries. This legislation would extend the abandoned mine land program for another 15 years by reauthorizing the fee on every ton of coal produced at the current levels. With fees provided by the current coal industry, this program has enabled the states to clean up mine sites abandoned before the enactment of modern environmental laws and regulations. Through the abandoned mine land program, coal companies have financed the cleanup of nearly 860,000 acres of land and waters impacted by abandoned mines, including over 45,000 open mine portals and nearly 1,000 miles of dangerous high walls, creating jobs and contributing to economic development in coal country in the process. With this in mind, it seems this committee's priorities are at odds when it comes to coal. The subcommittee has considered numerous measures related to coal production, each of which is designed to hamper coal development on both federal and non-federal lands. This includes several unilateral mineral withdrawals on federal lands, which would lock up these lands in perpetuity, jeopardizing our domestic supply of mineral resources. Additionally, this subcommittee has dedicated a significant part of its agenda to legislation that would eliminate longstanding financial assurance tools, create onerous and unnecessary fees, and surface mining techniques that are meticulously permitted and heavily regulated by the states. Further, they have held hearings to help to keep the wrong-headed anti-coal policies of the previous administration alive, including the moratorium on new federal coal leases mandated by then-Secretary Jewell. This unilateral ban on coal production not only halted the creation of well-paying jobs and reduced state revenues, but also blocked revenues to the AML program, as the AML fee is collected from both federal and non-federal production. These policies and proposals are not designed to increase revenue to the taxpayer or the AML program, as my colleagues claim. Rather, they are intended to make coal mining unprofitable by saddling the industry with costly regulations and permitting delays, while preventing access to coal reserves. The AML program fulfills the laudable goal of cleaning up historic coal communities to support environmental restoration and habitat conservation, as well as job creation and economic development. But I would remind my colleagues that the states cannot continue this important work without a healthy and productive coal industry. The AML program was last reauthorized in 2006, when U.S. coal production totaled a record-breaking 1,162 million tons. In 2018, U.S. coal production came to 756 million tons, a decrease of almost 35%. These trends are not driven by a lack of recoverable resources, but because federal policies have made it more costly to do business in this short period of time. As we consider the future of the AML program, we must carefully consider these trends and whether the current structure of the AML program and the AML fee is sustainable. We cannot advance policies that slow or halt production of coal altogether and simultaneously call on coal producers to fund programs like the AML in perpetuity. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the National Mining Association in opposition to this legislation.
Without objection.
And a letter from the state of Utah in support of this legislation.
Without objection.
I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce our first witness, Congressman Matt Cartwright, who is the representative from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and the original sponsor of H.R. 4248. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman
You're
Lowenthal and
recognized
Ranking
for
Member
5
Gosar, for calling today's hearing to discuss America's abandoned mine crisis. And thank you to our witnesses who have traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify in support of this critical legislation, especially my friend Robert Hughes from Ashley in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I live and represent. I'd also like to thank my dear friend and colleague, Congressman Glenn Thompson, for his support and partnership on the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act amendments of 2019. For the first few centuries of American coal mining, it was standard practice to mine an area until the coal was gone and then have the company simply move on to a new mine without cleaning up the old one. As a result, millions of Americans live less than a mile from an abandoned coal mine, and almost half of those people in my home state of Pennsylvania. Now, these hazardous sites pose risks to our health, to our safety, to our environment, and to our economy. They discharge acid and toxins into the waterways that provide drinking water for our homes, sustain our farms, and nourish our forests and meadows. Many abandoned mines contain open shafts, sheer high walls, unattended explosive, poisonous gases, and other dangerous features that place unsuspecting pedestrians and drivers and hunters at risk of serious injury and even death. In fact, experts conservatively estimate that hundreds of people have been killed by America's abandoned mines, including dozens of children falling into them. In my own district in northeastern Pennsylvania, people live with the impacts of abandoned mines every day. And then there's the subsidence. I have constituents who have woken up to find their backyards gone, or come home from work to discover that part of their house has collapsed due to subsidence, or their driveway is gone and their other car has fallen into it. That's a family's biggest investment, their family home, and people have had their homes decimated that way. They've seen the brooks, where their parents used to take them fishing, turn bright orange from all the toxic metals oxidizing and dissolved in them. That's the water our kids drink. It's unacceptable. It was problems like these that led Congress to take action in 1977, as the chairman mentioned, by passing SMCRA, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. SMCRA established the Abandoned Mine Land Trust Fund, AML Trust Fund, by charging active coal mine operators a small fee on every ton of coal mined in order to pay for reclamation of previously abandoned mines. Now, over the course of the first 40 years, the AML program has done a lot. It has eliminated over 46,000 open mine portals. It has reclaimed over 1,000 miles of dangerous high walls. It has restored water supplies to countless residents of coal-field communities. And it has created jobs and opportunities for economic development on land that was previously unusable. This is a huge accomplishment, but we still have a long way to go. The Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, which implements SMCRA, estimates that it will cost at least $10 billion to reclaim the remaining high-priority abandoned mines across the country. If Congress allows the AML fee to expire, as it will under current law, that urgent work will never be finished. Allowing that fund to expire and lapse would transfer the cost of reclamation from coal companies to the very communities who can least afford to pay, to the homeowners, to those who lost jobs when the mines closed, and whose economies are still being hamstrung by the ravaged lands and spoiled resources left behind. That's why Congressman Thompson and I introduced H.R. 4248, which we are considering today. Our bill will protect the physical and financial health of coal country by reauthorizing the AML fee collection at current levels for 15 more years. This bill would also reimburse states for AML funding that has been sequestered since fiscal year 2013, and it would increase the amount of funding available for certified states so they can continue their efforts to clean up their waterways and revitalize their communities. This legislation has been endorsed by over 100 organizations, including environmental protection groups, land trusts, recreational fishing advocates, and small businesses whose bottom line is impacted by abandoned mines. Moreover, as we will hear from our witnesses today, we have found an issue that has unified states across the country. The Interstate Mining Compact Commission, comprising all 34 states and tribal territories who depend on the AML Trust Fund, came to a compromise which is embodied in this legislation and has the support of every single state and tribe in the compact. At a time when people in this country must think that partisanship has consumed us, here we have a bipartisan, common-sense proposal that creates jobs, protects the environment, and saves lives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for considering this bill at this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cartwright. I now recognize the AML abandoned mine land operations author in this bipartisan bill, Representative Thompson of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the committee.
Chairman, thank you so much. It is great to be back with the committee today, even if it's just a guest appearance. I appreciate.
You have a speaking role.
Yeah, and a speaking role, no less. How about that? Now, thank you so much, and thanks to my colleague, Congressman Cartwright, who's been a great partner working with this issue. You know, let me just say up front, the coal that was mined that necessitated, you know, the act in 1977 and its reauthorization, hopefully here at this moment. It'd be great to do this in 2019, or at least 2020, we get this done, the reauthorization. I mean, that is the coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution. That is the coal that provided the arsenal of democracy that allowed our nation to remain free and to free the world of tyranny, and that arsenal of democracy was used to win World War I and World War II. As a grandson of a surface miner, I'm consciously aware of that. and I would never apologize for our coal industry. It's a vibrant industry. It's got an exciting future. I just hosted a Coal Innovation Carbon Summit, one of the first of its kind in my district. Folks from the White House attended, and it was, just highlighting the new innovations with coal in terms of the applications with manufacturing, fiber, foam, the significant amount of rare earth minerals that we're finding within our coal seam. So I will say that unfortunately, the Pennsylvania 15th Congressional District contains more abandoned mine sites than all the other congressional districts in America combined, although we're proud of the fact of what that coal was used for. I think it's important for the record to understand that in the timing of when most of this coal was produced in the middle of 2 world wars, in particular, there was an urgency message that came from government, for coal operators to move on before not taking the time for remediation at that point, because first of all, you wanted to leave those open and available, because we didn't know how long those world wars were going to last and how many more armaments and steel needed to be manufactured. And so government had somewhat of a role, to whatever degree, and the urgency of the time that we didn't do remediation at that point. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, I think, has been very successful. It has healed many of these scars in our lands and our waters. I see that firsthand. I see the economic impact. I see coal miners going back to work as, given the fact that remining, especially when you're dealing with a deep mine remediation, remining is the way to go. Be able to remine those sites. I've seen them recover. I've seen waters go from orange to clear, and some pretty good fishing, let alone great habitat that gets planted on those reclaimed areas in cooperation with our sportsmen to be able to support game. And so much remains to be done, though. And it's also important to note, I think, that this legislation since 1977 has been funded on a fee as a result of the hard work of our coal miners, a fee per ton. That and the fact that we have, so I want to thank all involved here. Thank you for inviting me to this hearing. Obviously, as we go forward, I certainly want to urge support for this reauthorization. It's proven in its success, and we need to get it reauthorized so we have the certainty to go forward to continue to clean up the environment, put coal miners back to work with remining, and create and experience continue the economic benefits that we've seen as we recover these areas. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Before we get to our witnesses in the second panel, I'd like to point out that we requested and received testimony on the bill from the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement, which will be part of the official hearing record. Unfortunately, their testimony was mostly just a description of the AML program with no indication of support or opposition. A follow-up request for clarification we did not receive from that follow-up any additional information. So I'm assuming that the administration's position remains neutral. With that, I am going to move forward and introduce our panel of witnesses. First, we have Mr. John Stefano, the Deputy Secretary for the Office of Active and Abandoned Mine Operations at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Welcome to the committee. Next, Mr. Jason Walsh, Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Walsh. Next, we have Mr. Bobby Hughes, the Executive Director of the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation. And finally, Mr. Alan Edwards, welcome to the committee, who is the Deputy Director for the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality and the Administrator for the Abandoned Mine Land Program. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on. And I'm going to try to keep you to that 5 minutes and ask you to please complete your statement. I'm going to allow the entire panel to make your introductory statements before questioning any of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stefano to testify.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is John Stefano, and I serve as the Deputy Secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Interstate Mining Compact Commission and the National Association of Abandoned Mine Land Programs in strong support of H.R. 4248. Reauthorization of SMCRA Title IV Fee Collection Authority is the top AML legislative priority for our two organizations. Without this source of funding, the AML programs will be unable to continue operating for long. In essence, to extend the AML fee is to extend the AML program itself. Based on expected AML fee collections between now and the end of 2021, added to the amounts currently remaining in the AML fund, the Office of Surface Mining projects that approximately $2.7 billion in AML grants will be distributed to the states and tribes over the remaining life of the program. That amount represents only a fourth of what is needed as compared to the current OSM estimate of roughly $10.6 billion in construction costs for remaining AML work. There are several key provisions in H.R. 4248 that we believe are critical elements of reauthorization. Section 3 would provide for the reimbursement of states and tribes for money spent on emergency projects. This is necessary so that they can continue to focus on their annual AML grant funding on priority 1, 2, and 3 projects. Without this reimbursement mechanism, entire annual AML grants in some states could be expended on a single AML emergency project, thereby delaying work on other critical AML projects. This is particularly true for the minimum program states. Section 4 would extend fee collection authority to September 30th, 2036. We believe this 15-year extension is the minimum number of years required to address the remaining inventory of AML problems. This section would also increase funding for minimum program states from $3 million to $5 million. This is necessary for the states to address their inventory of high-priority AML sites in a more expeditious fashion. Section 5 would exempt future payments from the AML Trust Fund from sequestration. It would also authorize and require OSM to distribute to states all funding that was withheld due to sequestrations from fiscal years 2013 to 18. The amount currently stands at $150 million. Taken together, these amendments will ensure the AML program continues to serve the vital purposes intended by Congress. At the same time that we endorse these changes, we recommend that other key provisions in Title IV remain intact, including priority system in Section 403, the current fee structure in Section 402, the mandatory funding distributions required under Sections 401F and 411H, and the inventory system in 403C. Resolutions adopted by our organization in support of reauthorization are attached to our testimony. In order to demonstrate the impacts of the AML program in different parts of the country, the state and tribal AML programs have come together, led by Wyoming and Pennsylvania, to develop a website that showcases the real and personal effects that the AML programs have had on the lives of their respective citizens. We recommend you view our worksnotdone.org website, which contains information from 22 AML programs scattered across the nation's coal regions. In terms of how these states and tribes have historically spent their AML grants, according to a pie chart on the AML grant funding produced by OSM, approximately $5.7 billion was distributed in grants derived from the AML fee to state and tribal AML programs between FY 1977 and 2018. Of that amount, $3.7 billion has been spent directly on construction of AML projects. OSM also reports that $1 billion has been spent on planning, designing, permitting, and managing the construction of these projects. A total of $4.7 billion has therefore been spent directly on statutorily authorized AML projects, 79% of the funding granted to the states. And according to OSM information, administrative expenses have been held to a mere 7% of total costs. While significant progress has been made since the passage of SMCRA in 1977, it is clear that our work is not done. Approximately 998,000 acres of high-priority AML sites remain throughout the country, representing over $10 billion in remaining construction costs. Costs to plan, design, and inspect these projects would increase the total unfunded cost by an additional 25 to 30%. In an era of increasing economic hardship for coalfield communities, and the state and EML programs have been more important than ever. In this regard, the full committee recently approved 2 bills that address innovative approaches for AML work, the Community Relationship Reclamation Partnership Act and the Reclaim Act. Significant AML and associated economic work have been undertaken by the states and tribes by the AML pilot program. And the bill the subcommittee has before it today, H.R. 4248, is the linchpin that holds many of these efforts together and is thus critically in fulfilling Congress's goals. All of these legislative measures have enjoyed significant bipartisan support, showing recognitions of both sides of the aisle and fundamental role of AML work plays in proceeding in human environmental health, supporting well-paying jobs, and creating conditions for economic growth. We trust that this support will lead to the passage of H.R. 4248, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Stefano. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walsh to testify for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance, a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations. On behalf of my organization, our partners, and the millions of members and supporters they represent, I want to thank you for convening this hearing today regarding reauthorizing the Abandoned Mine Land Program. The Blue-Green Alliance unites our partners to solve today's environmental challenges in ways that create and sustain high-quality jobs and build a stronger, fairer economy. Our partnership is founded on the belief that Americans don't have to choose between a good job and a clean environment. They can and must have both. Investing in reclaiming abandoned coal mines, the topic of today's hearing, is a clear example of this principle. Abandoned mine reclamation tackles environmental and public safety challenges while creating quality jobs and spurring economic development and diversification in coal communities. H.R. 4248, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act amendments of 2019, would help coal communities adapt to changing economics while reclaiming their natural wealth. There are currently over 5,000 abandoned coal mines across the country. According to the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, as has already been noted, it will cost at least $10 billion to reclaim just the remaining high-priority abandoned mines. These sites pose a clear threat to safety and to environmental and public health. Millions of Americans live less than a mile from an abandoned coal mine. At the same time, we are seeing economic challenges in many of these same communities. Because of technological advancements and changing consumer demand, we are now powering more and more of our nation with cleaner, cheaper energy sources. For generations, coal-dependent areas reliant on coal mining and coal-fired power plants have built their economies around coal, not only for the employment of their citizens, but for the revenue that supports their schools and other vital public services. As demand for coal decreases, these communities face a scary and uncertain future. The reclamation of abandoned mines is a key opportunity to address these interconnected crises in coal communities. Reclamation not only remediates the host of environmental and public health problems associated with abandoned mines, it also improves the economic health of these communities by freeing up that land for new, more sustainable economic development opportunities in industry sectors like agriculture, recreational tourism, manufacturing, even clean energy production. Additionally, it creates immediate quality job opportunities doing the reclamation work itself in areas where local unemployment levels can be very high relative to state and national unemployment levels. The AML program has reclaimed over $5.7 billion worth of AML projects and nearly 800,000 acres of damaged land and water across the country. Over the course of its first 40 years, it eliminated over 46,000 open mine portals, reclaimed over 1,000 miles of dangerous high walls, and protected 7.2 million people nationwide from AML hazards. The AML program also resulted in significant economic benefits. In FY 2013 alone, as an example, it supported over 4,700 jobs across the country, had a net impact of $450 million on U.S. gross domestic product. In Central Appalachian states alone that year, the program supported over 1,300 jobs and delivered a value-added impact of more than $100 million. While funds authorized under the bill would be used exclusively for reclamation of pre-SMACRA abandoned coal mines, Reclaimed mine lands and the areas surrounding them have great potential to be reused as sites for new economic growth. Across the country, abandoned mine sites have been leveraged to create jobs through sustained revitalization efforts, wildlife habitat restoration, and water quality improvement, and spur new economic opportunities in these communities. Reclamation is not just about cleaning up abandoned mines. It's about helping to rebuild the communities that powered America, as Mr. Thompson so eloquently, I think, emphasized. Coal communities are struggling like never before and are looking for a path to a brighter future. Abandoned mine lands can be transformed into engines of economic opportunity, creating stronger communities and ecosystems at the same time. HR 4248 is critical to ensure this outcome. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify and for considering this topic. We urge you to move forward with reauthorizing the AML program and swiftly passing this important piece of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hughes to testify. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. EPCAMR is a regional environmental nonprofit organization whose mission is to encourage the reclamation and redevelopment of land and remediation of mine water affected by past mining practices that represents the interests of community groups, conservation districts, and coalfield communities throughout northeastern and north central Pennsylvania's anthracite and bituminous coalfields. We cover 16 counties in northern Appalachia. We have 24 years of experience in working on abandoned mine reclamation issues throughout Pennsylvania. I spent the last 2.5 decades of my career with EPCAMR building strong, diverse public-private partnerships on a local level to address our mine-scarred landscapes and polluted waterways. Throughout Appalachia, an estimated 5.5 million people and at least 2.7 million people live within a mile of an abandoned mine site. Our coal regions are scattered with health and safety hazards, environmental degradation, polluted mine water, and poverty-stricken communities that need our support. Significant damage to our region is not often clearly visible unless you fly over it. You can depict what resembles a moonscape of black and gray calm banks, reddish-orange streams, water-filled pits, and mine fires among scattered green, reclaimed landscapes, and more recently, large warehouse distribution centers and new transportation corridors to access these previously secluded areas. The projected costs of reclamation, abatement, and remediation are substantial. They vary by site conditions, A&D water quality, and the flow of these mine discharges. All of our coalfield communities across the country are in need of a more diversified economic, social, environmental, and recreational opportunities and funding that SMACRA brings with it. I've lived in the center of the northern coalfields my entire life among the shadows of hundreds of abandoned mine features and have become really sick and tired of continuing to have to look at them 25 years into my career. I have 3 children and grandchildren growing up there who deserve better. Frankly, it's disheartening, and we can do better. The majority of the streams that I've grown up around still run orange to this day because of the very large flows, the expansive underground mine pools, and the expensive cost of treatment. It's not fair that my children have to live with this legacy of past mining that I've had to endure my entire lifetime. We've gained over 100 supporters of Pennsylvania and diverse interests that keep coming forward, including National Trout Unlimited, Pennsylvania Council Trout Unlimited, the Trout Unlimited chapters all across Pennsylvania, of which there are 49 of them, nonprofits, county conservation districts, municipalities, municipal governments, and have all signed resolutions, including the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the Pennsylvania Association of Conservation Districts, and the Pennsylvania State Conservation Commission. We've submitted for the record 5 letters that support reauthorization from businesses that emphasize job creation, economic investment, the importance of environmental cleanup, the protection of home ownership and businesses from mine subsidence, and public health and safety. Many other states are in support of reauthorization nationally, including West Virginia, Alabama, Maryland. National partners in Central Appalachia inform us there are dozens in support and are working to reach out to their legislators. Pennsylvania has the most AML sites. West Virginia is second. However, the problem extends south to Alabama, north to Alaska, west to the Powder River Basin of Montana and Wyoming, and tribal lands. SMACRA continues to eliminate the health and safety hazards in our communities while creating good-paying jobs and infrastructure improvements at the same time. There are many indirect benefits such as reclamation material sourcing, ancillary jobs, and local task-based improvements that occur. For example, there are more than 600 companies in Pennsylvania alone that have been contracted by the DEP for abandoned mine reclamation projects. This is a great opportunity for those who have worked in the coal industry and may have lost their jobs due to its recent decline to find work of a similar nature in the field of abandoned mine reclamation. SMACRA authorization can become a major generator for jobs and job creation in some of the hardest hit areas of the country where the coal industry is seeing rapid turndown. The majority of the work in Pennsylvania, an AMD remediation effort that occurs in our region, has to address the Chesapeake Bay restoration goal deficiencies. We're continuing to work with Pennsylvania partners to reclaim 14,562 acres of abandoned mine lands by 2025 under the Bay's Watershed Implementation Plan. That's 10,400 unreclaimed features, totaling 73,000 acres. That's 1,305 miles of AMD-impacted streams polluted by pH and metals. There's a $72 million annual loss in the Susquehanna River Basin alone for recreational values to anglers. Similarly, the Susquehanna River Basin has documented 489 untreated discharges that send 73.6 million pounds of acid and 31.5 million pounds of metals and sediments downstream to the bay every year. SMACRA funds could be allocated to those areas for remediation and reclamation. Perhaps most visibly, reclamation of mine lands can add to the economies of many of our regions by creating jobs which generate increased tax revenue for the local municipalities, school districts, and county tax departments. There are other ancillary benefits. As a part of the AML campaign, an unfunded, informative collective of local and national groups advocating for the policies and programs on abandoned mine reclamation, with the sunset of SMACRA 2 years away, we fully support the extension of the AML fund. We ask that Congress now authorize the AML fund and continue the fee collection, see the fees structured in 1977 historic levels, support the minimum program states to $5 million a year, approve the direct line item in OSM's budget to fund emergency projects, support the continuation of the mandatory distribution of funds and nonprofit AMD watershed cooperative agreements, and other priorities within the bill. There have been a strong response from HR 4248. However, the bottom line is we encourage and welcome more bipartisan support and leadership to step forward and co-sponsor the bill. In closing, my hometown, like many others in the coalfields, deserve attention, clean water, greener landscapes, good paying jobs, workforce development opportunities, and a better quality of life that can be gained through the continued extension and passage of SMACRA amendments of 2019. EPCAMR looks forward to working with Congress to further our goals in some of the hardest hit economically depressed areas of the United States that ironically help to build our country and this great nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Chair now recognizes Mr. Edwards for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Alan Edwards. I'm the Deputy Director for the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality and the AML Administrator. The state of Wyoming appreciates the opportunity to be here today and share our perspective of the abandoned mine land program and the proposed legislation. DEQ's mission is to protect, conserve, and enhance the quality of Wyoming's environment for the benefit of current and future generations. The AML program addresses these principles through reclamation of historic abandoned mines and assistance to historic mining communities to eliminate public health and safety hazards and to address the challenges presented by historic mining. The act was passed in 1977 and established both a coal regulatory program, Title V, and an AML program, Title IV. Since the passage of AML, operators conducting mining are required to conduct reclamation and to provide adequate reclamation bonding to ensure future reclamation. AML reclamation addresses mines abandoned prior to 1977 and not active coal mines. Some Wyoming accomplishments to date are over 25,000 acres reclaimed, over 2,400 openings closed, and over 127 stream miles restored. 127 miles, by the way, is approximately the distance from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia. AML coordinates regularly with OSM, and OSM approval is required at many steps. They are our partners in this process. This includes everything from the initial entry of a project into EAMLIS to the issuance of authorization to proceed with reclamation. OSM is directly involved in the process to ensure compliance with the Act. AML uses the OSM Inventory Guidance Manual to prioritize all Wyoming projects. Wyoming AML identifies every project to be funded with the estimated cost of each of our grant applications. Technology advancements have provided tools to improve field inventory work. As a result of an extensive field inventory conducted this year using that new technology, we anticipate that $125 million in newly discovered coal reclamation projects will be added to Wyoming's inventory. Every project will be prioritized and ranked by AML, and the final project list submitted to OSM for approval. Wyoming AML will also develop a plan, as required by the Act, to submit to OSM, which addresses newly discovered coal reclamation needs and funding. There is a perception by some that there is a divide between East and West and certified and uncertified. That perception is false. My experience is that all programs work well together, sharing new reclamation practices and sharing a common set of principles, most notably a commitment to fiscal responsibility. As you heard from my colleague, John Stefano, our two states have worked closely to address the challenges to our programs. Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon cautiously supports this legislation and appreciates that it is a simple, clean proposal that continues the program basically as it is. Everyone engaged in AML work is very familiar with the current structure, and in our view, it works very well. We know there will be interest to make changes as the bill advances, some of which may be significant. Wyoming will continue to track the progress. One concern is in regards to the fee. In the fiscal year ending September 30, 2018, the fee collection in Wyoming represented 54% of the national total. But coal production in the last year also decreased by 9%, and it decreased by 35% over the last 10 years. This directly affects revenues and will be reflected in reduced revenue available to AML programs for reclamation activities. Any proposal to increase the fee will increase the headwinds on our coal industry, potentially decreasing revenue available to AML programs. The AML program in Wyoming provides real benefits to the state, including mitigation of hazards, creation of jobs, and associated economic benefits for communities near AML sites. Last year, 577 people were employed in Wyoming through AML reclamation projects. In Wyoming, our AML work is not done, and we would be concerned about any consideration of reducing the AML funding that is returned to the state for reclamation purposes. In summary, Wyoming AML strictly adheres to the confines of the Act. We do it in a cost-effective, financially, fiscally responsible manner. We continue to mitigate threats to public health and safety and support coal-impacted communities, but our work is not done. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I'd like to thank the panel for your testimony. I want to remind members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair is now going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to recognize Representative Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, for holding today's hearing. Mr. Walsh, could you please talk about involving local communities in the decisions about mine cleanup and economic redevelopment, and specifically, why is local involvement so important, and what strategies can be used to increase local community participation?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Levin. First of all, linking reclamation projects to community-driven economic development ensures that the project actually meets the needs of that local community. And it also breaks down some of the silos that can exist between state-driven mine reclamation efforts and economic development efforts, which are also and often driven by local government, right? So sometimes you have a mismatch there and some silos that are created that need to be broken down. Prioritizing public input, prioritizing community participation is absolutely key to determining which projects get chosen and which are going to have the biggest impact on those communities. I think we have some very good language and a clear mechanism in the Reclaim Act as an example of how to do that, which was reported out of this community earlier this year. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And what can reclaiming AML sites do for communities left behind by the continued decline of the coal industry? And specifically, what kinds of jobs and community benefits are emerging from this sort of work?
It can do a lot. I mean, first of all, it needs to be recognized, and I think today's testimony underline this, that that unreclaimed abandoned sites are an economic drag on the communities where they exist, right? For example, it is going to be very hard to keep people in communities or even attract businesses, right, if a local watershed is polluted with acid mine drainage. That's not going to happen. So in effect, it really creates a ceiling on future economic development that we need to crack through. Once you reclaim that site effectively, you free up all kinds of opportunities. And those are going to range depending on the communities, depending on their assets, their emerging industry clusters. We have examples across the country of exciting work that has been done on recovered mine sites, right? From a wind farm in Wyoming that's been built on a former site to an industrial park in Pennsylvania that now houses 39 different businesses, to one of my favorites, an agriculture and aquaponics project built on a former site in Mingo County, West Virginia, that's also powered from a geothermal energy source that's right there in the portal. So there's a lot of exciting, innovative mine reclamation going on around the country, and we need to continue it and scale it up.
I read about that Wyoming wind farm, and I think that highlights the tremendous potential that these sites offer for renewable energy siting, and not just abandoned coal mines, but also abandoned hard rock mines, former military sites, other similar locations. Mr. Walsh, what do you think we could be doing to encourage more renewable energy on these previously degraded sites?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think this is an area where we need to seek out some better alignment, probably between federal programs. I think OSM already works closely with some of their colleagues in the Department of Energy and EPA. I think we can do it better. But I think we need to start by recognizing that many of these sites are actually ideal for utility-scale projects, ranging from solar to wind to, in the case of the example I just gave, geothermal. And none of these happen unless you actually remediate the site. It cannot be done. And so the remediation is the basis upon which we're going to build cleaner energy sources. I want to emphasize that's not always going to be the opportunity in a place. There are different economic opportunities by sector, but it's certainly one of the most exciting ones out there.
Well, I really appreciate that, and obviously any ideas or suggestions I think are welcome as we accelerate the transition to a more sustainable energy future. I think this is of great importance, will become increasingly so, and we thank you all for your work in that regard. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Representative Levin. I now recognize Representative Cheney for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. I also want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Thompson, for this important legislation, and it's wonderful to see Alan Edwards here this morning. He was a little bit humble in addition to the important work that he's doing both at our DEQ and administering our AML program. He's been recognized nationally for his dedication and commitment to ensuring that that this program is administered the way it should be, and is obviously an expert in the field. And I'm very, very proud to be here today and to have Wyoming so well represented as well by Mr. Edwards. As we've talked about many times in this committee, Wyoming is obviously the nation's leading coal producer. We produce 40% of America's coal today, and we produce the cleanest coal in the world. We produce more coal than the next 6 coal-producing states combined, and we contribute the lion's share of the resources to this important fund. So we have a real stake in it. We have a stake in its continuation and also in how it's administered. And I do want to point out that in terms of consistency, it's critically important as we're talking about the good that this program can do, the importance of these resources. We cannot continue to pursue a path where too often in this committee, we find ourselves criticizing the importance of our coal industry, criticizing those who are so heavily involved and engaged in coal industry in this country. You can't, for example, advocate to end the federal coal leasing program and then also talk about how important it is to have these resources doing the things that they do. So I think it's important for us to recognize, as we do in Wyoming, that our coal is a tremendous natural resource and is crucial for powering the country. Obviously, Wyoming is a certified state, and I'd like to ask Mr. Edwards if you could start by talking a little bit about, first, the relationship between Wyoming's coal production and making sure that we can continue to sustain this AML fund. If you could tell the committee how those two things are connected.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question. Obviously, coal production in Wyoming has ramifications all across the board to our local economies, jobs that support families, but for the purposes of what we're here for, there's an extremely direct relationship between the coal production and the AML. First, without a coal regulatory program, we could have we would not have been able to get a AML program. But with the production of coal in Wyoming, and based upon how the act is actually structured, every program, every uncertified program in the country benefits from Wyoming coal production because we get paid from a different source. So 100% of our money goes through the AML Trust Fund to support nationwide the other uncertified programs. So there's a very important link between the programs.
Thank you. And one of the issues that we also focus on at length, that I've focused on, is making sure that certified states, Wyoming obviously in particular, isn't hurt by any language that might be included in extending this program. And so I'm pleased that that does not happen in this legislation. But I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit in terms of why it's so important for certified states like Wyoming to make sure that we continue receiving resources, even though it comes from a separate source, and talk a little bit about what some of those resources are used for.
And thank you for that. Wyoming, as I stated, is clearly not done. We've got a lot of new reclamation, and what we're finding out is as our knowledge increases and the technology increases, there's a whole lot more out there that we haven't found yet. So we use that for high-priority coal, but also some very high-priority non-coal, because on the public lands, the recreation is increasing, and with our non-coal resources on public lands, they really have a hazard that might not be understood by, like, my colleague from Pennsylvania. So it's used for all those purposes. As my other colleague said, it also supports local communities through jobs, contractor support, and it does provide economic return to the communities surrounding the AML sites.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the chance to ask questions, and with that, I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Cheney. I now recognize Representative Cartwright for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hughes, you're here as the Executive Director of the Eastern PA Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, EPCAMR, right? Now, you mentioned in your testimony the impact of acid mine drainage on watersheds, both within and beyond the boundaries of Pennsylvania, in locations that are far away yet downstream from an abandoned mine, and I want to get you to elaborate on that. Can you tell us, whether through watersheds or otherwise, how somebody who doesn't live in a neighborhood or a district with abandoned mines in it may still be affected by acid mine drainage or other issues related to abandoned mines?
Sure, Congressman. To give you an idea of some downstream communities that are outside of the coal region and where a lot of the water quality AMD impacts are and how those impacts are felt, when we do cleanup work in the headwaters, tributaries within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, for instance, we're allowing for that cleaner water to move downstream that could be used for other sources, other industries that are along the river. It could be a potable water supply. It could be a steam utility company like PPL that's right along the river. There are other businesses that could use that water for consumptive use or low flow augmentation when during low flows, water could be released if it's treated to bring water levels up and to be utilized by other industries. There's also in other areas outside the coal region that we depend on businesses and industry for different materials like limestone that we don't have in the coal region that has to go towards the treatment of mine drainage treatment systems by the tens of thousands of tons. And that high calcium carbonate limestone is used for not only AMD treatment, but it's for ENS controls, and it's also creating jobs in the trucking industry in sectors that are from outside our region, like in the Hershey area or Lancaster or State College, where we've got to go 50 to 100 miles to get that resource to be able to treat the water.
Well, I thank you for that, and I want to follow that up with more discussion of downstream effects. You know, in our area, we're struggling with the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan. We have obligations, Pennsylvania does, to comply with that. And what that's doing is we have to pay for that, and it's being put on people's sewer bills as an additional fee. And everybody's pretty upset about that. In fact, they're calling that the rain tax. It's not an entirely unsuitable nickname for it. If this bill were to pass, what impact would that have on Pennsylvania's ability to meet its obligations under that implementation plan? And would it help ease some of the requirements that the homeowners of Pennsylvania are currently shouldering through increased fees on their sewer bills?
Well, I think with the Chesapeake Bay, with their watershed implementation plan that they have, Pennsylvania would be able to strive to reach the goal of the 14,562 acres that are targeted for reclamation by 2025 under that plan. There's 73,080 acres that are unreclaimed sites that still need to be taken care of. And as I mentioned before, those 1,300 miles of streams that are impaired by low pH and metals would have a chance to become a higher priority for remediation and reclamation under this bill. Tree plantings, riparian restoration projects would be completed, and we need to actually start counting mine drainage remediation projects and get credit for the reduction on the sediment loads of iron and manganese and aluminum and metals that we are putting in treatment systems in our region, in the coal region, to protect downstream waters. And that doesn't happen right now under the plan, and it needs to. And the burden for residents downstream, like people that are paying the increased sewer fees, this funding would go towards reclamation, mine drainage, and alleviating some of the stormwater problems that we're having on these AMD sites. And groups like the Wyoming Valley Sanitary Authority up in the Northeast that we're working very closely with could focus putting their fees on green infrastructure projects and CSO treatments for combined sewer overflows and the separation of those to improve the water quality. And then, or leverage the federal money that comes in on larger projects that we've helped them identify for future consideration under their MS4 permit for municipal stormwater separation. It could actually overall lower the contributions to a particular project, and they wouldn't have to be asking for such a high fee from residents locally that can't afford it as it is. And those are big projects.
That's so important. Thank you for that. So if this bill were to pass, it would help the homeowners, wouldn't it?
Sure would.
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks for testifying. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cartwright. I now recognize the Ranking Member Gosar, for 5 minutes of
Thank you,
questioning.
Chairman. Mr. Stefano and Mr. Edwards. As a government-run program, continued oversight of the program is very important, making sure that the funds are going to fix the hole in the ground with minimal expenditures for overhead and administrative costs. Can you describe the types of expenditures needed for staffing your state's AML program and to conduct reclamation work? Specifically, what types of costs are considered administrative or overhead, and what costs are necessary to are incurred for construction or cleanup? Mr. Stefano, go first.
That's a very good question. Thank you, sir. You can't just walk out and say, push the dirt into the hole. So there's a lot of preparation that is required to actually design a project. So you're talking about physically somebody designing the project, putting plans and specifications together, obtaining any appropriate permits, and putting that all together, then actually putting that up for bid. That would all fall under the category of administrative costs.
Mr. Edwards?
Mr. Chairman, that is a very good question. Each state does it just a little bit differently. In our case, I categorize our administrative cost as my staff and my time to actually administer the program, to oversee all the construction, and to do that. We have a staff of 12. We commit all the rest of our work to consultants who do our NEPA, our cultural clearances, all the other federally required items that happen before a project is done. The consultants also prepare our design and do construction management. All of the remainder goes to construction. So in our case, I would consider our administrative costs to be roughly 4% each grant year, and all the remainder is pushed out to support consultants and contractors and physically get the work done that's critical in the field.
Would you give a percentage, Mr. Stefano, like Mr. Edwards?
In Pennsylvania, we are very similar to Wyoming, which does include the inspection on that. In Pennsylvania, our administrative costs are at about 3%.
Now, what are your states doing to ensure that the maximum amount possible is spent directly on the rehabilitation of the priority AML sites? Mr. Edwards?
The Act for Certified States does give the authority, grant the authority and the responsibility to also address the high-priority non-coal. So we basically use the OSM prioritization criteria to rank every project, whether it be coal or non-coal. As I indicated in my answer to one of the earlier ones, Wyoming is 48% federal surface. So we face different challenges than others. So we might not have 1 million people close to where a mine is, but we have all the recreational, hiking, four-wheeling, and everything that goes along with the others. So in order to get that done, we rank and prioritize every project, coal or non-coal, and we work very closely with our partners. It's part of the community outreach in that we work with our small communities, but we also network with all of our federal agencies that we have to coordinate with on a day-to-day basis.
Do you leverage any other philanthropic groups, environmental groups like Ducks Unlimited, Audubon Society? I mean, these have been participants who've been willingly trying to help out and donated their services.
Mr. Chairman, that's also a very good question. We're not similar to Pennsylvania in that regard, in that we don't have organizations with money to really bring to the table, but we do coordinate with Trout Unlimited and everything on a lot of the projects. They typically haven't brought money to the table, but they help figure out how best to implement it. Where our outreach really works is primarily with the Bureau of Land Management. They have looked to us to provide the expertise for AML reclamation on BLM lands, and in return, under a cooperative agreement, they also provide some funding every year that we use in replace of strictly AML funding. So it saves them the need to set up a new program with the resources and the funding, but they also provide us funding to offset some of our costs.
Real quickly, the two of you, how accurate are the inventory of AML sites on the inventory? How accurate are those numbers?
The inventory itself, yes, is very accurate. The cost estimates within the inventory may be of concern because when the original inventory was put into place back in the 1980s, but the inventory itself, although it does expand at times because as urbanization expands out, but the inventory itself, as maintained and approved by OSM, is pretty accurate.
Do you agree?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree.
Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions, and I'd like to ask the entire panel about some of the reforms that are in the program, that are contained in the bill. Since it's not just a straight reauthorization, for example, the bill before us allows states to be reimbursed for AML emergency project work, and it increases the minimum amount of grant money each state receives from $3 million to $5 million. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Hughes or Mr. Stefano or anybody who wants to start, but I'll start with the two of you first. How much of an issue is the AML emergency problem in Pennsylvania or in other places that you're familiar with? Do states receive sufficient funding in their annual AML grants to cover this work? What happens now if an emergency develops and a state has already committed its entire yearly grant funding? Mr. Stefano or Mr. Hughes? Mr. Stefano?
I will give you the quick overview. Overall, all of the states do about 250 to 300 AML emergencies a year, which are costing us about $20 to $25 million a year. Within Pennsylvania alone, we average between 70 and 80 a year, and that is costing Pennsylvania about $3.5 to $4 million a year, which those funds currently are coming out of our annual AML grant, which then potentially delays other AML projects that would normally be priority 1s and 2s that we would have to address. And with regards to minimum program states, if you do get a large site that may be a mine fire of such that could potentially wipe out a program's funding, that would take some serious delays on actual AML projects being done on the minimum program states.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. They're an issue, and I mean, it's an added workload for the state's Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation beyond their annual project work schedules for their priority 1 and 2 sites. But more and more people are moving closer in proximity to these areas where mine subsidence issues are being more prone to occur, and making previously undetermined sites that don't have a priority become higher priorities. And there's also more frequent flash flooding and stormwater events that we're dealing with that's moving coal silts and fines and bed loads of material down, causing blockages in streams and blowouts of mine subsidences and mine discharges in areas that we haven't seen before due to increased storm events. And the post-mining in our region, anyway, in the anthracite, when they've used the room and pillar method, it causes subsidence. They collapse over time. If those areas haven't been backfilled or slurried on the way out, and when they retreated from the mining that occurred historically, those sites are eventually going to fail. So those become the emergency sites that the State Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation has to deal with.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh or Mr. Edwards, do you have anything to add to that about the emergency funding issue?
Mr. Chairman, first to clarify, I'm a certified state, not a minimum program state, but in the years I've been here, I've had the opportunity to work with my peers very closely. The minimum program states currently get $3 million a year, but I'd like to note for the committee that that's also subject to sequestration. In the 2019 distribution, that was 6.2%. There's 2 states in particular that we queried before we came here. And this is the inventory, which is only construction cost. One had a unfunded remaining liability of $62 million, that would be Maryland. Another one had an unfunded liability of over $800 million with no coal production to supplement their AML. So with those, they've got a lot of years left until they're going to be able to complete their reclamation. So if you have one emergency project in the year, it could easily wipe out the funding they have available and limit their ability to work towards the completion of their overall inventory.
I would just quickly add that these emergency events are a very strong argument for reauthorizing the fee, right? Because of the AML program is not there fully funded, there is literally no other funding source to deal with these emergencies. And we are dealing with abandoned sites that are not static, right? I would just also add, to reinforce what Mr. Edwards said, that minimum program states, you mentioned the $800 million, I think that's Kansas, right? Oklahoma, Arkansas, these are states with huge abandoned mine problems, and the more we can direct to those states to deal with them, the better.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back. I'd like to now recognize Representative Lambourne for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Representative Lowenthal, and thank you for having this hearing. I have a couple of questions for Mr. Stefano and Mr. Edwards on third-party remediation efforts. But first, I'd like to just make a comment. Mr. Edwards, I've been to the Powder River Basin in your state of Wyoming, and I've seen some of the reclaimed abandoned mine lands. And I was impressed by the fact that these are not just restored to as good as what was before, but better than what was before, because invasive species that have come into the state are not included when the ground is reseeded. So I think that that's a remarkable thing to realize. Now, how does rehabilitating AML sites affect local economies? Oh, you know what? Let me save that for last. Let me get right into third parties. When you have a third party that wants to come in Pennsylvania or Wyoming, for instance, what's been the experience when people volunteer or come in that are not traditionally under federal laws normally allowed to do remediation, but your states have allowed that? What's been your experience?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And in Pennsylvania, we actually have a Pennsylvania Good Samaritan legislation that was enacted. And up until this point, we have about 70 sites out there where we've had Good Samaritans approach us with a proposed project. We have a lot of great partnerships. So we have such a big inventory, we're always looking for new opportunities, and here is a good opportunity where they can come in, take on the responsibility of addressing, whether it be acid mine drainage, doing a reclamation work, and be free of the liability that since they did not cause the problem. So we have about 70 on the books right now, and we're looking for continuing to do more. And I think we can do more with the Community Relationship Partnership Act that was put out there as well, because I know there was a lot of them that had concerns on the federal level regarding the liability. But there are a lot of great partnerships out there, and I know earlier it was mentioned about other foundations that provide funding. We have a lot of good groups in Pennsylvania that like to pursue projects and are always looking for opportunities to partner with us where they can input funds with that and take on some of the actual addressing of some of these AML problems we have in Pennsylvania.
Excellent. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have not had any third-party reclamation in Wyoming, but I would emphasize that we work very closely with a lot of those groups. They help us design and identify what is the best option. Those projects have been done through our traditional AML reclamation. We, however, have implemented some programs for outreach in other areas to just emphasize that. For example, we have a middle school program that we do every year to assist with some of our revegetative plantings so they get the education on the value of the work that's done for AML.
Excellent. Okay, and Mr. Stefano, let's see, is it possible for industry itself, the coal industry itself, to be a third-party remediator and to do a good job?
Yes, we actually have a large-scale refuse pile site that was done and completed in Pennsylvania. It covered 49% of the borough of Ehrenfeld. And basically a coal company bid on the actual construction project, and they provided the reclamation of the site, and in the process actually hired 40 miners that had been laid off previously. So it shows that there are opportunities for coal operators to come in and actually assist and do reclamation work. We also have what we call government finance construction contracts in Pennsylvania. Essentially, it is where a miner can come into a site who wants to mine coal. It may be on a site that had been previously mined and needs reclaimed. And we have a process in place where they can come onto the site, and as part of the reclamation, with their mining of the coal, they will actually complete the reclamation at no cost to us.
For this kind of remediation to work and be successful, do you have to deal with the unlimited liability that CERCLA would otherwise impose?
There are some liabilities if it's a third party. In the case of a mine operator, when they go in under the mining permit, there are some certain responsibilities they are taking on. With regards to the nonprofit groups and those partnerships with those that approach us, that's where the ones where the concerns of the liabilities come in. So they want to come in and do the good work and be a good Samaritan, but they're not sure that they would potentially be on the hook once the whole touched it, you bought it syndrome.
And I understand the laws are written, the intention is good, and I believe, and I think everyone would agree, people need to be responsible for their own actions. But we have to address the situation where someone comes in and should they have liability going back to the beginning of time? I think that's a real issue we have to deal with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. And now I recognize Representative Westerman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Thompson, for bringing this legislation. You know, there's a lot of coal mining, or has been in Pennsylvania and Wyoming and other states, but a lot of people don't realize we actually have some old coal mines in Arkansas. And Mr. Cartwright already talked about acid mine drainage. But I want to look at this more from a state perspective, so my questions are for Mr. Stefano and Mr. Edwards. And I want to talk a little bit about the set-aside account specifically for the acid mine drainage, and how do states ensure that streams not only obtain high water quality, but how do they retain that quality after they've been cleaned up?
Thank you. That's a very good question. In the state of Pennsylvania, currently we have over 5,500 miles of streams that have been impacted by acid mine drainage. We do take advantage of the 30% set aside, which is very vital. There's a combination of when you do construct a facility, which Pennsylvania has probably between 350, 400 government-financed treatment facilities out there, which do require operation and maintenance. So with the set-aside allows us to actually construct those facilities, but also continue to operate and maintain them, which obviously they would need to be done in perpetuity in some cases. So the continuation of the fund allows us to have that fund and ensure that they can continue to be operated and maintained. Should the funding be either, not be reauthorized and we cannot continue with that set aside, there is a good potential that all these streams that we haven't cleaned up over the years would potentially revert back and become polluted once again.
And under the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, what kind of priorities are these projects considered?
I mean, our ultimate priorities are the 1 and 2 projects. It's a balancing act because obviously acid mine drainage is a big problem in Pennsylvania, and it creates a very big economic impact to our coal communities. So we have to balance addressing the priority 1s and 2s, which is the priority of the health and safety, but also there is the environmental benefits and the economic benefits of cleaning up these acid mine drainage impacted streams. And it was also mentioned, some of these do impact bigger watersheds such as the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a real balancing act, but they all need to be addressed.
And another provision of the legislation increases the funding for minimum program states from $3 million to $5 million. Can you explain the differences between an uncertified state and a minimum program state? Mr. Edwards?
Mr. Chairman, there really is no difference because you have certified and uncertified. There's a subset within the uncertified that are the minimum program states, and that's defined by those whose production is such that it's below $3 million. So there needs to be makeup funds to give them at least a minimum of $3 million under the current act, and the recommendation was to increase that to 5 to make more accelerated progress towards reclamation.
And as was discussed about the ongoing maintenance, we also need to think about the ongoing maintenance of the fund. So do you have any recommendations for program improvements that would help safeguard the fiscal responsibility going forward?
That's an ongoing thing that I know Pennsylvania has in working with my sister states through both of these organizations. We're always looking for new innovations, new technologies, and new ways to be more efficient with the funds that we have to ensure that we can get the most out of the funds that are available to us right now.
And I was wondering if the states have developed any projections about the cost of future AML work or how much progress could be made in the AML inventory during a 15-year reauthorization.
As we testified, I think at a minimum we need 15 years to address the priority in 1s and 2s at a minimum. With regards to the inventory itself, I mentioned earlier that the AML inventory is we're comfortable with that. It's the cost estimates within the inventory that we have concerns about, and that's because they were based on, estimates that maybe were done back in the 80s. So we also anticipate that some additional monies above the 10 million would be needed to ensure that we can address all of those 1 and 2 priorities. And this is based on a report that was developed with the IMCC, looking at the inventory and the actual cost that we are actually doing to complete reclamation across all of the states to kind of come up with the new cost of what we feel we need to ensure we can address the 1s and the 2s, which also includes in order to get a 1 and 2 reclaimed, sometimes you need to take a 3, which is the pile of material to fill the hole in the ground.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I now recognize Representative Thompson for 5 minutes of questions.
Chairman, thank you, and thank the ranking member for this hearing. Gentlemen, thank you for bringing your expertise on this topic. Thank you for the shout out to Aaron Field, Pennsylvania 15th Congressional District, Cambria County. Real proud of the work that's going on there. It's a great example of the importance of abandoned mine reclamation, and specifically speaks to success of the Reclaim Act as well, under which that project kind of got its start. And I think the best way to speak on the support for this reauthorization we're talking about is really to look at the success stories. In July, I had the privilege of leading a small but bicameral group from Congress, House and Senate, to several recovered mine sites in West Virginia, actually. This was actually led a group of Eagle Scouts from the House and the Senate to the Boy Scout World Jamboree in Beckley, West Virginia. And this is a site of several, this 14,000 acre site that we went to is a site of several abandoned mine sites that have been reclaimed over the years. And it is an amazing place today. It is a great success story. It now is the home of the Summit Bechtel Reserve in Beckley, West Virginia. And just one example of that July event, there were scouts, boys and girls from over 167 countries. There were 45,000 leaders and youth, 40% of them female within the scouting program that were there. Just one example of many successes. Mr. Hughes, can you describe any that come to your mind of some of the best success stories that we've seen in Pennsylvania in recent years?
I can give you an example of one of the projects that we're working on now that is similar to a reclaim project, but it's leveraging monies that we think that SMACRA dollars can do if it's reauthorized as well, where the private sector industry from several cogeneration plants are taking the waste coal piles in from our project in the Congressman's district here, Congressman Cartwright's in Swarsville, PA, that is leveraging $8 million of private sector money to a $4 million grant that we've been able to receive from the state to be able to reclaim 15 acres on a private piece of property owned by a coal company who's donating back 7 of the 15 acres back to the community that is in need of recreational areas and a community athletic field, and also just to have green space within their community and remove a large calm bank on 55 acres. This is just phase 1 right now of a larger project that will then reconnect the community that's never been reconnected in the past 60 years. So this is an effort that's underway right now that not only is going to remove the waste coal pile, it's probably going to increase property values of the homes around that area. We've already done a watershed assessment of that particular creek, which is a trout stream that comes through and then it's impacted by this mineland area, that we have a feeling that it could be restored once this is all done. And those economic impacts will come later once the restoration occurs. And we're also dealing with stormwater issues in that community where all this coal silt and sediment is in their stormwater system that they're having to pump out and remove because it's flooding their streets. So there's ample examples of benefits that can be done through SMACRA on a project like that we're seeing in our community that will not only benefit, Swarsville Borough, the recreational area of the community, the kids that enjoy those areas, the fishery impacts, and also reducing water that's going into the underground mines in that area that are infiltrating a local mine pool in that valley that is causing even further problems downstream that we will take care of by putting that water back up on the surface.
Good, thank you. I wanted to just speak briefly on the efficiency of this program. I think broadly from everything I've seen that the administrative overhead costs are about 2 to 3% to administer these tremendously impactful programs. And I think that's excellent. That's to be commended, but it also leverages dollars, and from the private sector, from nonprofits, NGOs. And so I'd like to, my question for Mr. Stefano, maybe Mr. Hughes, specifically in Pennsylvania, do you have an estimate of how many dollars from the private sector, nonprofits, entities like Trout Unlimited, watershed associations, are matched with every dollar of federal AML monies on projects, or a range? Probably differs project to project.
It does differ from project to project. I think I have this number right. It's usually, I want to say it's somewhere between $1.50 and $3 as far as additional dollars that are brought in, as far as match monies that are out there, and it does vary, but they are out there, and we maximize the use of that to leverage what we can to accomplish the lot of work that is yet to be done in Pennsylvania.
Congressman, just to give you an example, while I don't have the numbers of what the ratio is dollar for dollar, I do know that, with there's 300 publicly funded treatment systems out there being taken care of by volunteers that are in the datashed.org website that I referenced in my full testimony. But if the value of those volunteers just on a federal independent sector level of putting a number on what an hour's worth of their time is about $25 an hour. And if you take the number of volunteers across Pennsylvania that are working on AMD treatment systems to operate and flush and maintain those systems annually, it's a very large number that otherwise might have to be put on the backs of the AML fund to do that in the state if those folks weren't in those communities, their own hometown communities, taking care of those projects themselves and reducing that overall cost to those funds that we would have to be putting towards it.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. We're just about to come to a close, but before we end, I'm going to allow from each side, first the ranking member and then Mr. Cartwright, to ask one question that you wished had been asked or that you would like to follow up on. First, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Technology, I think everybody's brought it up. So I'm looking at what other opportunities are there to mitigate some of these sites. Particularly, I'm looking at the rare earths application, in which we've now found substantial aspects within overburden areas within these coal mines to maybe repurpose to get something else out to continue this aggregate. Is there other technologies? I want to see where you go with this.
That is something that started a number of years ago, but more recently, a multitude of states. The rare earth elements is a big issue right now. I don't want to say it's an issue, it's a big benefit, because they have identified, and including within the state of Pennsylvania, there's an area that has some real high quantities of it that were surprising to people, and they are found within the coal bed fields as far as above the coal itself. So there's a lot of different opportunities that are being explored with regarding the technology, because in the past, it was the economics of retrieving the rare earth elements, but that has progressed to the point where it's now becoming where it may be more economical viable, whether it be coming out of the acid mine drainage or other ways. So the technologies are there and becoming more and more there to address that, which also provides a benefit where someone may be going back into a site that has been AML impacted in order to retrieve the rare earth elements, and also at the same time would be cleaning up an AML issue.
Mr. Walsh, do you have anything? Mr. Hughes? Yeah.
Chairman, the potential economic development impacts, I think there are many. I mean, alternative energy projects were mentioned before, recreational tourism, Congressman Thompson talked about, community recreation, solar panel farms, hemp farms, beekeeping industries, greenhouses, fishery improvements, the wind farms, hydroelectric potential of using AMD, geothermal systems from underground mines and the temperatures of the water that come to the surface, and the rare earth metals recovery are projects. We've just started a proposal with Tetra Tech, a major international company that wants to work with us to sample mine drainage across Pennsylvania at 50 different locations to find out what type of materials we may find in some of these discharges, see if there's potential for that to be recoverable in the future here. So we're putting together a proposal actively for a future potential funding project to submit to the state. And I think we're missing we're missing a chance at a resource here if we don't look at the mine drainage and the potential to reuse that water and all the water that's coming out in the billions of gallons to our streams and rivers locally and across the country, because it's an untapped resource, honestly. And if we're not going to bring industries in to take a look at using the water, how are we going to create these industries that we need to bring people and bring jobs to our communities to clean up the water? Mr. Edwards?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, I do apologize. I'm unfamiliar with that issue as it relates to Wyoming, so I have nothing to offer.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member Gosar. Now, in conclusion, Mr. Cartwright, you have the last question.
One question.
Last question.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to all of our panelists who came here and took the trouble to testify before us today. My last question is for you, Mr. Walsh. Jason Walsh, you are Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance, and as you've testified, that is a coming together of environmental groups and labor organizations, and it's based on the premise that it's a false choice that we always hear about between, on the one hand, economic development and job creation, and on the other hand, protecting our Mother Earth, safeguarding our environment. That's a false choice. You don't have to choose between one or the other. We can do both. And you said that in your testimony. What I want to give you a chance to do, and you touched on this a little bit too, in my own district, in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, we have an example of that. We have an abandoned mine that was cleaned up, and there's an industrial park that was put on it, and you've touched on that in your written testimony, and I want to give you a chance to develop that and to elaborate on what that is.
Thank you for the question, and I think you articulated what the Blue-Green Alliance does better than I could. I think whether it is the industrial park example you provide, or and which I mentioned, or some of the other examples that have been given, I think we need to understand that there are enormous assets in these communities, that if we remediate the pollution that has come before, can really be maximized for economic benefit and economic growth. And one of the reasons we, as a coalition, think this legislation is so important is that it's that an example of being able to meet both environmental needs and economic needs at the same time. We don't always get those examples in federal legislation, and your bill, Mr. Thompson's bill, I think is both an example of that and really a model. And it also, I think, reflects that we have both a short-term issue here and a long-term issue, right? In the short term, some of these communities badly need immediate jobs. We haven't talked a lot about the nature of the jobs that are created. These are essentially heavy construction jobs, all prevailing wage, all providing a living wage to the workers who do it. But then we have some long-term challenges as well. Communities that need to be diversified economically, that have relied on a single industry for too long. And making those linkages is important. Of course, your bill, the Reclaim Act, is an example of how we make those linkages and how we build on them so that we can invest in these communities that have provided so much to this country over so long.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. I found this a very informative and helpful hearing. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing. The hearing record will be held open then for 10 days for your responses. If there are no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.